Brussels Bytes, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi. Throughout this podcast series, we have talked a lot about transatlantic relations and US tech, but we never had an episode devoted intimately to the transatlantic tech relationship. Until today, I am delighted that we can sit down together with Bill and Clara from the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. We'll focus on the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, taking stock of what has happened so far and the road ahead. Also, we will touch on the overall political dialogue between these two economic giants and what's in store for the relationship in the crazy election year of 2024. Most importantly, we'll also discuss, can the EU-US work together on some of the most important technological challenges of today? And I'm really happy that today, joining me from CEPA are Willem Echikson, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Digital Innovation Initiative and the editor of the online tech policy journal Bandwidth at CEPA. We're also joined by Clara Riedenstein, who is part of the Digital Innovation Initiative team also at CEPA. Clara, Bill, I'm really excited to have you today.
Thank you very much, Dimitar.
Thank you, Dimitar. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, we are recording just a bit before Christmas, so mid-December. I'm really happy to have this conversation today because it's also tied with a joint product which the Martin Center and CEPA are developing right now, and will soon launch an official report devoted to the Trade and Technology Council done by our both institutions. So I decided it will be exciting if the three authors can sit down for a quick chat on the TTC. And without further ado, Bill, maybe you can kick us off. What was the initial impetus or the initial political or practical rationale for having such a thing between the EU and the US?
Well, thanks, Dimitar. It's been a pleasure. We've been researching this paper and this subject for the last 3 to 4 months, and it's been super interesting. And one thing we discovered surprised us that this goes back to the Trump administration. This was a European proposal done in the depths of deep transatlantic freeze, I would say, or deep transatlantic disagreement. And it was a European Commission proposal for a council that would at least restart dialogue. The Trump administration didn't listen to it, ignored it. But when Joe Biden became president, it was revived. So it is a European proposal. I think the idea was to avoid having some sort of super ambitious trade agreement negotiations that would become divisive, but to set up a council that would at least get the two sides talking again and discussing the key issues.
Yeah, get the two sides talking. And indeed, throughout the last, 2 full years, we've had a number of sessions taking place in different geographical locations on both sides of the Atlantic. But Clara, you were doing a lot of background digging on what actually transpired in these meetings. So maybe you can give us a very brief history of the summit so far.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, the TTC was set up by the Biden administration formally. And the structure of the summits is that the two sides meet every 6 months, alternating between the EU and the US. The first summit took place in September 2021, and there have been 4 summits in total since then. I would say 2 things about the summits thus far, and that is borne out in our report, which is, for one, they have rather unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you view things, coincided with a lot of geopolitical turmoil and tensions between the two sides. So if you take the first summit, for example, this took place right after the AUKUS deal, the famous deal between the US, the UK, and Australia, on nuclear-powered submarines, which very much annoyed the French, leading to tensions right before the first summit. And you see a similar thing play out with every summit since then. The second summit was overshadowed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which led to a lot of movement on the TTC side. So they were able to coordinate on export controls against Russia and Belarus, which was positive. But then in the third summit, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the somewhat protectionist green subsidies piece of legislation that was passed in the US, which also frustrated the EU in some respects. So you have that element to the meetings, and then second of all, the meetings are consist of 10 different working groups that work together on different trade and tech issues, and each working group comes out with initiatives and hopefully concrete solutions to some problems. And the solutions that we've seen, some working groups have been more successful than others, but all in all, you see very incremental change versus perhaps the big geopolitical issues being addressed that maybe you would hope from summits like this between the two big powers.
So just to jump in, these are very, very good points of the whole framing behind it. And I think with Bill, we've discussed even before, when the whole thing started, there was also maybe different expectations from the different stakeholders on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of approach. Bill, right? Can you summarize the initial approach in a couple of sentences for us?
Yeah, I think this was foreseen as a technocratic sort of European-style approach, which frankly has disappointed some Americans. The big questions that divide the U.S. and EU have been avoided on tech regulation. So as Europe has raced ahead to put in very strong new rules on digital content and platform responsibility and on gatekeeper power of big tech, and now most recently, just a day or two ago, about artificial intelligence, there's really been little out of the TTC to discuss potential differences between the two sides. The EU keeps insisting that it's going to do its own regulation, and the US is sort of stuck following along, and that has sort of sidelined the TTC in many ways. Where the TTC has been a success, I think, is that we went through a period where we had to coordinate on Russia, where we had to coordinate on how to confront China, and at least the TTC has come up with some broad guidelines or been helpful in, as Clara said, getting some export controls through past the door on Russia, and on China going away from sort of decoupling to de-risking, but we really still have questions about how to define that. So I think the overall goal is it's good that the U.S. and the EU are talking again under the Biden administration and von der Leyen, but the TTC has sort of punched under its potential weight and is not really addressing some of the key digital regulation issues.
Okay, so after the Trump years, we finally started talking again. The US had its own, of course, incentives to also try to influence maybe the European agenda or try to coordinate on that, whereas Brussels pushed through with its own vision and different incentives. But Clara, we reached Summit 3, which happened relatively recently, but what were the most important breakaways, in closing of the summits, the third and the fourth summits in the last, let's say, 1 year? What for you was the most interesting happening there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the concrete achievements have been fairly incremental. However, at times, specific and pointing in the right direction, as Bill mentioned. So in the fourth meeting, you have a joint roadmap on AI, which the two powers are trying to coordinate in terms of formalities around artificial intelligence, how you frame taxonomies, and so forth. You have an early warning mechanism on semiconductor shortages, which was also agreed on in the fourth meeting. And then on more specific specific deliverables that are somewhat practical, you have, for example, the agreement on charging points, making those compatible for electric vehicles on both sides of the Atlantic, which would help on the trade side. And so all of these initiatives are promising, but the criticism remains that, and a lot of analysts put it this way, a lot of these achievements are either starting or ongoing, but few of them are completed. So for the joint roadmap on AI, you have a good start, but what we're lacking is sufficient traction to make both the people holding the summit and us as observers commenting on the summits feel like we're going in a specific direction. So
yeah, Clara. So
goal-orientedness is missing.
Yeah, I think the practical achievements are thin. I'm going to play devil's advocate, as cynical. Europe has just gone along and passed an AI Act, which puts strict obligations on the private sector. In the U.S., there's only voluntary commitments. I don't see that the joint roadmap has really led to a joint roadmap. We're driving ahead at different speeds. So I think when we look at it, the TTC's actual concrete accomplishments are pretty thin. We even looked in depth at there were announcements of some connectivity investments in Jamaica and Kenya, and we said, what is that? And we couldn't find out. Is it that they're going to build new mobile phone networks without Chinese parts? Is it that they're going to give digital training? We called around and no one could give us, even at the Kenyan and Jamaican embassies, we couldn't find any details. So I think, we have to look about this bottom line as a talk forum, and it needs to be strengthened if it's going to survive the political turbulence that you mentioned that we see ahead.
Yeah, and by the way, the SIPA colleagues were great in investigating this, not only through documents and online records, but through meeting actual stakeholders who are involved in these discussions and various working groups or formal or informal formats. And the point Bill just made is particularly pertinent. But I mean, to rewind a bit, Clara mentioned some pretty damn important stuff. No semiconductor supply chains, keeping each other informed on the most important stuff. Not only informed, but making joint standards on tech. There's lots of low-hanging fruit, and I think we're getting there. But there, as you guys said, there's a mismatch between the intent and the actual deliveries. But yeah, 10 working groups with different objectives: semiconductors, export control, alignment potentially, also disinformation and citizen protection and online space and all of that. So we are, as we are right now, it's late 2023. Bill, what are your most important highlights about the TTC and the way forward? What can be improved or is not obviously working?
So bottom line, we need to keep some sort of dialogue open. The only dialogue right now on these issues tends to be the TTC, and we need to make it stronger so it can survive the political turbulence, a return of Donald Trump to the White House, far right in Europe, etc. So, I mean, the concrete things that we are suggesting is 1, 10 working groups, too many, cut them down. Focus on the big issues, a couple of key groups. 2, put in some other stakeholders. We saw the AI summit in the UK actually attract CEOs, attract congressional leaders.
The Brits are great in selling themselves.
Yeah,
exactly.
So the TTC could really improve by opening it up to the private sector input and. We also see that there's no real parliament-to-parliament dialogue on these issues. That could be a real improvement to bring in the U.S. Senate and encourage senators to participate, some EU parliamentarians. Right now, it's bureaucrats to bureaucrats or executive branch to executive branch, and that's not sufficient. So we make these practical suggestions that we believe would strengthen the TTC. Another one would be, as we've seen now, having 2 summits a year is just too many. it leads to overkill. And right now we've postponed the latest summit because the agenda is too busy. We have Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East. The American administration just didn't have time to do this. And Secretary of State Blinken wants to attend apparently wants to attend the next summit. He's attended past summits. So it's been put off for 2 months. Perhaps we go to one summit a year, one summit every 18 months. But the constant rush to have big meetings and meetings that underwhelm with skimpy results is something that undermines, we think, the potential effectiveness of this forum.
And you have the incentive for the working groups and everybody involved who has, imagine you've just wrapped up one issue and then another summit is around the corner. You need to think of a quick win or something. And
the way it was the way it was described to us by several participants was, we finish, we go back and get some sleep, and then we realize we got to rush again to get a new summit done, and that doesn't hasn't been proved productive, and I think tires out the participants and dilutes the energy and the focus of the effort.
That's one of the main takeaways from the joint report on the TTC, how to reform the format, about meetings and about the working groups. But what can you tell us, question to both, about the future goals and what else in terms of policy approach should we really dwell on?
Yeah, so I think that we've touched upon a lot of this already, but it's clear that there are a handful of issues which should be a real priority and are a real priority for the US and the EU individually, and both sides would stand to gain from coordinating on them. There's a few issues that are somewhat legacy issues between the US and the EU, including data deals, for example. That has been a big point of tension between the two sides for years now, and a format like the TTC is very well placed to deal with them. And then on the other side, you have big picture questions, which really require a forum like this in which there is consistent communication that include, obviously, artificial intelligence, alignment on China, making sure that for the green transition, we have our policies that coordinate and complement each other, rather than each doing their own and standing in each other's way, but also, maybe
I think you mean
energy that can be used elsewhere. Yeah.
Or competing against each other.
Yeah.
I think, or competing against other. So on a lot of these issues that we've discussed, we're at a time when both Europe and the US are becoming more protectionist, less free trade. And at the last summit, they didn't get a deal on green tech, subsidies to green tech, or on trade that would have helped climate change. This will become even more difficult if we get a Trump and right-wingers in power on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think we're going to need some real political will in the next year to try to get a deal on how much we subsidize our chip makers, or complementing so that they coordinate, so that the two big chips programs on each side of the Atlantic don't compete but complement. The same thing on green tech. I think we should be able to find a deal that would resolve some of the tensions over steel and aluminum and put in place an idea to help renewables on both sides of the Atlantic rather than fight over it. So I think we really could and should try to get some deals on these major issues. I think also on coordinating on export controls on China, we've made a good start with ASML restricting exports to China of its semiconductor machines, and the TTC can play a role in helping make sure that both sides don't undermine the other's efforts in attempting to de-risk from China.
Absolutely agree on these points with some brief caveats. For me, the two most important takeaways, and I fully subscribe here, is exactly on the green tech area and finding ways in terms of trade or coordination on export controls and tariffs, even though politically very difficult and touchy. But in the long run, if you want to oppose China's subsidized model fueled by also slave labor or human rights violation when it comes to the decarbonization technology, the clean energy tech, we need to work together on this. And on the AI, it's it's very easy to say everything and nothing on AI or just mark the buzzwords, but I think we will deviate and go in different ways on AI in the US and the EU, and this is fine. But most importantly, we need to regulate the big question, which nobody's seriously asking internationally, is how to put the guardrails on proliferation of this really, really, really advanced technology, and also on biotechnology, because right now through AI you can have also breakthroughs on really nasty biologically related issues and potential diseases and whatnots. So these are big questions, and I think this forum needs to rise to the challenge. But speaking of which, right now, the latest we heard, we were a bit surprised even with the colleagues a couple of days ago, we found the news item that the next fifth summit will be postponed for sure, maybe until next spring, and it will take place in Brussels during the Belgian presidency, and without much details. So, Bill, what do you think is happening right now, and why is there, people's agendas are busy, or what?
Yeah, as we were speaking, I mean, the latest one was postponed too. The one that's supposed to be in Washington in December was pushed off to January. So I think, there's two ways of interpreting it. One, that the TTC is not at the top of policymakers' agendas, that they have too much to do with Ukraine and the Mideast. Or two, we heard that Secretary of State Blinken wants to attend, thinks it's important, and that wanted to make sure that he could be there, so he postponed so he could be sure to attend, which would say that the policymakers still believe this is kind of important to protect. I'm not sure which one to believe, and I think only we'll see in the coming months whether the TTC manages to gain sufficient traction to stay on course and be a key dialogue point between the US and Europe. And you're right, Dimitar, we won't see complete alignment on digital regulation or on AI. What we can see is that where our interests coincide, that we don't compete necessarily. And I think that's more a focus on things like semiconductor subsidies, green tech, and other types of connectivity issues, perhaps too, on getting Huawei out of our networks and so forth.
Yeah, especially on the latter, that there's been this seeming consensus on at least the easy stuff we need to agree on, the Chinese threats when it comes to hardware and software. Even the European Commission started openly in very plain language labeling companies which are untrusted vendors, quote unquote. But we still see that this is meeting the friction in many member states, Germany, Central Europe, but even honestly Western Europe more. I think Pompeo had this really successful initiative where he was touring Central and Eastern Europe a couple of years ago, and he was getting signatures for the Clean Network Initiative and banning Huawei and so forth. So I think we have also an internal division in the EU on this. The East is quite willing to go this way, but the West is in a different direction. But anyways, let's not get carried away on these issues.
I think you're right. This is a tough issue. I mean, it's a lot of money at stake, and the telcos are going to have to invest a lot. And
but it's critical infrastructure, for God's sake. No, this is so important.
No, you're right. And this is something that we haven't really discussed at the TTC, as far as we can tell. This is the type of concrete issue that I think we could have a more robust, clearer discussion from each side.
I am really tempted, because you guys are native speakers, connected with the US in different ways. What's your views on the transatlantic relationship right now when it comes to overall political state of play, grudges, grievances? How do you measure the situation right now?
So I think it's a great question. I think, compared to 5 years ago when the TTC idea was first launched, It's obviously much better than under Donald Trump. I think there's been coordination on Russia, coordination on China. The temperatures and dialogue is much stronger. I think President Biden is definitely committed to Europe, but I think there's great fear on both sides of the Atlantic. I think there's great fear that Donald Trump will come back into power and pull out of NATO, perhaps, definitely take a transactional approach to the alliance and maybe just impose unilaterally tariffs on both China and Europe. So I think, everywhere we go here in Brussels, people ask me, everywhere I go, they ask, will it happen? Will he win? And I think that's like a giant shadow over this relationship that's so important to world peace and to our Western prosperity and strength.
Clara, how do you see the dynamic?
Yeah, I think I would agree with almost everything Bill is saying. I will say that potentially one of the problems that we've always had with this relationship is that the EU's attention on the US is greater than the US's attention on the EU, which reflects in its policies, but also, as we were discussing before the start of this podcast, actually, is reflected in even things like media coverage. In the EU, you're having a lot of conversations around digital regulation, what the EU is doing or not doing, and the US isn't really covering it all that much. And so what you want to be doing with a forum like the TTC is making sure that the US also cares and is engaged about exactly on these differences and has an open dialogue with the EU and treats it as an equal partner. I think that is the benefit of a forum like the TTC and something that you want to strengthen in general, because they are both very large economic powers. And as Bill says, it's an extremely important relationship for geopolitically in general.
Yeah, it's kind of a no-brainer to have these alliances and these mechanisms and tools like the TTC when we talk about these economic blocks when it comes to market sway, and not only economy and prosperity, but also joint interests on national security, the way the networks function, and the tech you're investing in. Final quick cue to both of you. Let's go micro on the relationship, but on digital specifically. We touched base on AI. We have different approaches. We continue, and I'll be very honest here, we continue to have certain grievances here in Brussels about the way European data is used in the States, whether the National Security Agency in the US has access to European data with less safeguards than we have here in Europe. Of course, the never-ending big tech regulation sagas and all that. Is it, Clara and Bill, is it a really big issue also media-wise or politically right now on digital, or it's less intense?
So I do see in the US press attention given to the AI Act and other EU digital regulation. I do see also the tendency to say this is targeted against US companies, and it is typical of EU or European overregulation. Produce your own Google, produce your own Facebook, but don't.
We tried and failed miserably with public money more than a decade ago.
So, I mean, Europe wants to be a regulatory superpower, and that plays into some American stereotypes about Europe, unfortunately. But I do think, the U.S. actually shares a lot of the same concerns about tech that Europe does, that it proliferates disinformation, dangerous content, that platforms should take more responsibilities. I think that there is a feeling, certainly in the Biden administration, that antitrust should be more vigorously enforced. So there are some commonalities, but the U.S. is not moving as fast as Europe to regulate on this because of its own political divisions and difficulties. I think the TTC is a place at least where we can talk about our differences. The differences will remain, but let's hope that we can at least keep the dialogue open and temper each other's, maybe Europe's overregulation and the US's political impasse and were able to find some sort of middle ground, common ground in some ways.
Okay. Clara, what's your take on digital?
I think digital is interesting. I think that what we've learned in this discussion somewhat is that digital is maybe one of the areas where the US and the EU are always going to have almost ideologically different stances, which is different from other things such as semiconductors, et cetera, in which we can very much align on and be on the same page. I think that to a large extent that is positive. As in all relationships, you probably need both sides that are going to push you in different directions, but that is only helpful insofar as those two sides discuss and compromise and maybe adapt to one another. So I will add to what Bill said that, for example, in Europe, you are seeing pushback to the AI Act. So you have Macron, yesterday talking about the dangers of the AI Act and stifling innovation in Europe, and that you have the French startup Mistral valued at 2 billion after 8 months, and so there does seem to be more diversity than perhaps the cliches or the stereotypes would have you believe in either position. And so perhaps we should take it would be beneficial for everyone if you acknowledge that there is a diversity of views on both sides as well, and accentuated that on the digital front.
So I think the bottom line, Dimitar, is that we have a marriage, the Europe-American marriage. It was close to a divorce. The TTC was part of the sort of marriage counseling. It hasn't been as successful as it should be in repairing all the rifts. Right now, though, we're not in court. We're not hiring divorce lawyers. Let's hope a year from now, when we come back, we will be in a similar or stronger position. That's all I can say.
I fully subscribe to that. Guys, this has been great. This was Bill and Clara from the Digital Innovation Initiative, part of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And in January, we will publicly distribute our joint report on the EU-US Trade Technology Council, which was done by the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies and SIPA. So Bill, Clara, thank you again for this great conversation. And to all of our friends and listeners, have a happy 2024.
Thank you, Dimitar.
Thank you, Dimitar. Thanks.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bytes. Follow us on SoundCloud for more.